Hello again. In the last segment we talked about Athanasius' claim against the Arians that somehow what they were claiming for Christ and for themselves, really, all Christians, was akin to the spirit of Lucifer in Isaiah 14. Now you remember that most modern Bibles do not render this passage with the name Lucifer. They usually use expressions like shining one, son of the dawn, day star perhaps, as this translation, the ESV, does. Here's the passage anyway. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. So in that ambition, Athanasius and many theologians over the centuries have seen the spirit of a doctrine of salvation that brings man up to God by his own bootstraps, by his own efforts towards progress and growth and godship. So that if sovereign grace, that is the free will of God, is to be preserved according to this view, the free will of man has to be limited. And grace has to win out over man's free will ultimately, because otherwise, according to the logic of Scripture, no man could be saved, which is, after all, what Paul says in Romans 1-3. It was up to God, by his grace, to elect Abram. That's where Romans goes after we establish universal guilt in chapters 1 and 2 of Romans. He goes to the story of God's calling Abram. The free will of God, calling a man who responds yes, but who is not calling upon God. God is calling upon him. So this is Athanasius' point of view, that the I will spirit of the king of Babylon, actually, when you read the context of Isaiah 14, and of course in the history of Christian theology that's been taken as a reference to Satan, a reference beyond the text, admittedly. What is the sin of Satan? What is the sin of all human rebellion? What is the sin of the fallen angels? Well, it is a claim to sovereignty outside God's sovereignty. So orthodoxy saw Arianism in this light. Now later in the book, Gregg and Grove give credit to what it is that animates, on the good side, what is it that animates Arianism? Well, it's a belief that the oneness of God has to be preserved. So its good side is it's emphatically monotheistic. But is it biblically monotheistic is a question that comes up in the book. This is what T.E. Pollard says, is quoted by the authors here. There can be no doubt that the compelling motive of Arianism was the desire to preserve a strict monotheism. But that does not mean that its monotheism was biblical. The God whom the Arians declare to be one is not the living God of the Bible, but rather the absolute of the philosophical schools. So again, the accusation is that in some sense, this vision of the one God was more pagan than it was biblical. Now, in another video or two, we hope to get into that aspect of it, that the vision of the one God in the Old Testament is far more variegated than even the Jews liked, because the Septuagint reacts against the Hebrew text when it translates a lot of the passages that are too anthropomorphic, meaning that the texts about God in the Old Testament seem to make God too human for Jewish comfort. And so that tendency to want to bring God not down to our level, but push him further away, is very plain in even the Septuagint translation and other rabbinic views or improvisations upon the Hebrew text. The Hebrew text allows, as we saw in our Genesis videos when we're talking about hope of Israel, and the divine names also, those videos, we saw that the Hebrew text makes room for the idea that God can appear and God can speak personally. Well, the Arian tendency makes no room for this, and neither does pagan philosophy. God is shoved further and further away, and therefore needs more mediators, angelic mediators, levels of mediation to intercede for him. And correspondingly, we need more levels of mediation to get to him. So in the book, later in the book, Gregg and Grow make links to Ebionitism. You may have heard of Ebionitism. It's thought to be the surviving Jewish strain of Christianity that escaped the destruction of Jerusalem after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 to 73 and the end of the temple and the end of the possibility that Jewish Christianity could survive in the rubble after. Ebionitism escaped to several different locations in the Roman Empire and grew apart from the rest of the Christian churches and in isolation till finally it apparently waned completely away. They talk about whether there's some truth to the claim that the Ebionites were the spiritual ancestors of the Arians. On page 165 of their book, they say this: the first Christians gave these the suitable names of Ebionites. This is a direct quote, by the way, from Eusebius, called the father of church history. The first Christians gave these the suitable name of Ebionites because they had poor and mean opinions concerning Christ. They held him to be plain and ordinary man who had achieved righteousness merely by, and get this phrase, by the progress of his character, and had been born naturally from Mary, her husband, and her husband. So the Ebionite view of Christ was, even by Watchtower standards, lowly. He was merely a man who was blessed by God because of his progressing character. So that's one possible aspect of the Arian strain within the church. And then there's the possibility that they were somehow connected to the book of Hebrews. And in the next episode we'll talk about the possibility that the book of Hebrews is actually the most serious biblical route to Arianism.